April 1943. The hot North African sun beat down on three German women standing in a British interrogation tent near the ruins of Bizerte, Tunisia. Kate Weber pressed close to Anna Muller and Greta Schneider, her hands shaking as she gripped the younger woman's arm. An American officer walked past them, speaking to a British soldier. The words coming from his mouth made Kate's heart stop cold in her chest. He was speaking perfect German. Not broken accented classroom German learned from textbooks and grammar drills. Perfect Hamburg German, the exact dialect spoken in the beer halls and corner shops of the city where Kate had grown up. The same rounded vowels her grandmother used. The same clipped consonants her father spoke when he was excited or angry. Kate's fingers dug into Anna's arm hard enough to leave marks on the pale skin. She whispered in a voice tight with confusion and fear. "Did you hear that sind wir im falschen Land? Are we in the wrong country?" The younger woman's blue eyes went wide with the same bewilderment that was crawling up Kate's spine like ice water. Even Greta Buani, who always stayed calm no matter what happened, who never let emotion show on her sharp-featured face, looked troubled. Her dark eyes followed the American officer as he walked away, still speaking that impossible perfect German. They had been captured by the British 3 days ago. Everything they knew, everything they had been taught, everything the officers had told them said that the British spoke English. The Americans spoke English. The enemy did not speak German. The enemy hated Germans. The enemy wanted to destroy everything German. But this man spoke like he had been born in Hamburg, like he had grown up eating sauerkraut and singing folk songs and walking the same streets Kate had walked as a child. Something was very wrong. Or maybe, in this thought terrified Kate more than anything else, maybe something was very different from what they had been told. What these 847 women would discover in the next 4 months would shatter everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. It would destroy their understanding of the world. It would crack open their certainty like an egg and let something new and frightening pour out. This is the true story of enemy prisoners who found freedom in the place they least expected it. This is the story of how kindness defeated propaganda, how truth conquered lies, and how American values proved stronger than any weapon of war. The spring of 1943 brought disaster to German forces in North Africa. After months of fighting in the burning desert, after sandstorms and supply shortages, and the slow grinding certainty that the war was turning against them, Rommel's Afrika Korps finally collapsed like a building with its foundation torn away. The British and American armies closed in from all sides, tightening like a fist around the throat of the German position. In early May, approximately 130,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. Among them were 847 German women who served with the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. These women worked as radio operators, cipher clerks, and signals personnel. They were not fighters. They had never fired a weapon at the enemy. But they wore uniforms and they served their country, and they believed, most of them, that they were on the right side of history. Kate Weber was 24 years old. She came from Hamburg, a big port city in northern Germany, where ships came and went carrying goods from all over the world. Her father had owned a small shop selling imported coffee and tea and spices before the war closed it down. She had grown up middle class, comfortable, eating well, going to school believing that Germany was destined for greatness under the new government. 2 years ago, she had joined the Luftwaffe Signals Corps because she wanted to do her part. She worked as a radio operator, sending and receiving coded messages about troop movements and supply shipments and the 1,000 small pieces of information that kept an army functioning. Back home, somewhere in the cold Atlantic waters between Europe and America, her fiancé Klaus served on a U-boat. She had not heard from him in 8 months. Every night before she fell asleep lying on the hard cot in the signals tent in Tunisia, she wondered if he was still alive. She wondered if he was eating enough. She wondered if the British destroyers had found his submarine yet. She wondered if she would ever see him again, ever feel his arms around her, ever become his wife, like they had planned before the war changed everything. Anna Muller was only 19 years old. She came from a tiny farming village in Bavaria, in the mountains of southern Germany, where the air was clean and cold, and the fields grew wheat and potatoes in neat rows. Her family's farm was small, just enough land to feed themselves and sell a little at market. When the war started, there was no work left in her village. All the young men had left to fight. The fields grew wild because there were not enough hands to tend them. Anna joined the Luftwaffe because she needed to eat and because she wanted to help Germany win this war that everyone said would be over quickly. She worked as a cipher clerk, turning coded messages into readable German so the officers could understand what the radio operators received. It was boring work, mechanical work, but it was important, and it made her feel like she mattered. She wrote letters to her mother every single week, long letters describing the warm weather in Tunisia and the sand that got into everything and the other women she worked with. She never mentioned that she was scared. She never mentioned that at night she dreamed about her village and her mother's cooking and the boy named Johann who had promised to marry her when he came back from the war. She had not heard from Johann in 9 months. He was somewhere in Russia with the Wehrmacht. She tried not to think about what that meant. Greta Schneider was 31 years old, the oldest of the three, and the sharpest. She came from Berlin, the capital city, where the government buildings were tall and imposing and everything moved fast. She had gone to university, which was rare for a woman in Germany, rare enough that people noticed and commented. She spoke 3 languages fluently, German, English, and French. She understood how the world worked in a way that Kate and Anna did not, because she had studied it, analyzed it, taken it apart to see how the pieces fit together. Greta had joined the Signals Corps early in the war and had risen quickly to become a senior officer. But she had a secret that she kept locked away in the deepest part of her mind, a secret that would have gotten her killed if anyone discovered it. Before she became a signals officer, Greta had worked analyzing propaganda for Luftwaffe intelligence. It had been her job to measure how effective the posters were, how well the radio messages worked, how much the German people believed what they were being told. She knew it was all lies. She had seen the reports, read the internal memos, watched the propaganda being manufactured like sausages in a factory. She knew that the Allies were not barbaric monsters. She knew that German cities were being bombed because Germany had bombed other cities first. She knew that the war was not going as well as the newspapers claimed. She knew all of this, and she had stayed silent because speaking the truth meant death. She had chosen survival over honesty, safety over integrity. And the guilt of that choice sat in her stomach like a stone every single day. For months, these 3 women and 844 others had served at a signal station in Tunisia. They lived in tents that flapped in the desert wind. They ate dry bread and thin soup and drank water that tasted like rust from the metal containers. They sent messages about German soldiers retreating, about supply lines being cut, about the slow, inevitable collapse of everything they had been told was strong and permanent. Then the British and American tanks appeared on the horizon like metal beetles crawling across the sand. The German commanders told the women what to expect if they were captured. The propaganda was clear and terrifying. The British would execute women prisoners, or force them into hard labor in mines and factories, or do worse things that the officers would not say out loud but that everyone understood anyway. The women were taught to destroy all their equipment and fight to the death rather than surrender. Being a woman in enemy hands, they were told, meant certain horror. At least that is what the propaganda promised. But on that bright morning in May, when the British tanks rolled into their camp at dawn, there was nowhere to run. The German army had retreated so fast during the night that they left the women behind like abandoned equipment. The 847 women had no weapons. They had no vehicles. They had no way to escape into the desert where they would die of thirst within 2 days. They raised white flags made from bed sheets and stood together in the morning sun, waiting to see if the propaganda was true. The British soldiers were professional. They searched the camp methodically, but they did not harm anyone. They did not shoot anyone. They did not drag anyone away screaming. They gathered all 847 women in the center of the camp, and a British officer stood on top of a truck and spoke through a loudspeaker. His English was translated by another soldier who spoke German with a strange accent that none of the women could place. "You are prisoners of war now," the translator said, in careful formal German. "You will be processed and transported. You will be shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to a holding facility." That was all they were told. No details, no explanations, just those few sentences that changed everything. Kate felt her stomach drop when she heard the words across the Atlantic. That meant America. That meant Canada. That meant thousands of miles from home, thousands of miles from her mother and her city, and any chance of seeing Klaus again if he was still alive. That meant months in captivity. Maybe years. Maybe forever. Beside her, Anna started crying quietly, tears running down her face and dripping onto her dusty uniform. Greta put an arm around the younger woman's shoulders but said nothing. Her face stayed blank and controlled, but her mind was racing with questions. Where exactly were they going? What would happen when they got there? Would any of them survive this? The women were loaded into trucks and driven north to a larger British base near the coast. They were given numbers and processed like cargo being inventoried. They stood in long lines under the hot sun, while British soldiers checked their names against lists on clipboards. Medical officers looked them over quickly for obvious diseases or injuries. They were given clean clothes to replace their dirty, sweat-stained uniforms. The British were efficient and cold and impersonal, but they were not cruel. Nobody hit them, nobody threatened them, nobody touched them inappropriately or made crude jokes. This was just business, just procedure, just the machinery of war, processing its human products. This confused Kate more than anything else. Where was the torture? Where was the violence they had been promised? Where were the horrors that the officers had described in such vivid, terrifying detail? That night, the 847 women were locked in a large warehouse near the port. They had blankets and water. The floor was concrete and hard, but it was better than sleeping in the sand. Some women cried. Others prayed to God and whispered German. A few argued in low voices that this was just the beginning, that the real horror would come later, that the British were lulling them into false security before the torture started. Kate lay on her blanket and stared up at the metal rafters of the warehouse ceiling. She thought about Klaus somewhere under the cold Atlantic water. She wondered if he knew she had been captured. She wondered if he was eating better than she was or worse. She wondered if she would ever see him again, ever touch his face, ever hear him say her name. The way he used to before the war turned them both into numbers on a list. Greta sat with her back against the wall, watching the other women with those sharp analytical eyes that never seemed to rest. She was thinking about the German officer who had told them the British would kill them. She was thinking about the British soldiers who had given them water and blankets and medical examinations. She was thinking about how the propaganda and the reality did not match, not even a little bit, not in any way that made sense. This thought scared her more than capture, more than the uncertainty of what would happen next, more than the long journey across the ocean. If the propaganda was wrong about this, if the lies were this obvious, when confronted with reality, then what else had she been told that was false? How deep did the deception go? How much of what she thought she knew about the world was built on sand instead of stone? The women spent 3 weeks in the British camp, waiting while ships were prepared and schedules were coordinated, and the bureaucracy of war slowly processed them toward their next destination. Then one morning the announcement came that sent a chill through everyone who heard it. They would board ships bound for Canada. 847 German women would cross the ocean to a place none of them had ever seen, a place they knew nothing about except what the propaganda had told them. And after what Kate had heard in that interrogation tent, after hearing perfect Hamburg German coming from American lips, she was starting to wonder if anything they had been told was true at all. The women faced the unknown. They did not know what came next. They did not know if they would survive the journey. They did not know if the horrors were still waiting for them on the other side of the ocean. But they were about to discover something that would change some of them forever. They were about to learn that sometimes your enemies know your language better than you know the truth. May 1943, the British loaded all 847 German women onto a massive passenger ship called the HMS Empress of Canada. The ship was enormous, bigger than any building Kate had ever seen in Hamburg. It was a luxury liner before the war built to carry wealthy passengers across the Atlantic in comfort and style. Now it carried prisoners and soldiers and the debris of a war that was reshaping the entire world. Along with the women, 2,400 German male soldiers were also on board, captured in the same North African campaign. The men were kept on different decks, separated by locked doors and armed guards. The women would not see them during the voyage. They would not speak to them or share meals or even know if they were being treated the same way. They were isolated, cut off alone with their fears and their questions and each other. Kate, Anna, and Greta walked down a metal stairway into the ship's interior. They expected to be thrown into cargo holds, dark spaces where supplies were usually stored. They expected chains on their wrists. They expected to be locked in the darkness for the 3-week voyage across the ocean. They expected to be treated like dangerous criminals, like enemies who could not be trusted, like women who deserved punishment for serving the wrong side. Instead, British sailors with professionally neutral faces led them through narrow corridors to small passenger cabins, real rooms with real beds, not straw scattered on a floor, not hammocks strung between posts. Actual beds with mattresses and springs in the kind of comfort that Kate had not experienced in almost 2 years. Anna reached out and touched one of the beds like she thought it might disappear if she moved too fast, like it might be a mirage created by heat and exhaustion and desperate hope. She had been sleeping on dirt and sand for 6 months straight. This mattress felt like clouds, like impossible luxury, like something from a dream of the life she used to have before the war. Each cabin had 4 beds arranged against the walls. Clean white sheets sat folded on each mattress, waiting to be spread out and slept on. The cabin even had a small sink mounted to the wall with a tap that actually worked. Kate turned the handle and watched cold water pour out into the basin. It was cold, but it was clear, free of the rust and sand and mineral taste that had contaminated every drop of water in Tunisia. In the desert, water had come in battered containers that leaked and tasted like metal. This water looked pure enough to drink straight from the tap. The ship left port on May 28, 1943. The engine rumbled deep below their feet, a constant vibration that made everything feel alive and moving and unstoppable. Kate stood on the deck for as long as the guards allowed, watching the African coast disappear into the heat shimmer of the horizon. She did not know if she would ever see Europe again. She did not know if her mother was still alive in Hamburg. She did not know anything except that the world she had understood was crumbling, like old bread. Beside her, Anna was crying quietly again, the way she cried almost every day, now soft tears that she tried to hide from the other women. Greta stood with her arms crossed, watching the ocean with those careful measuring eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. She was always watching, always thinking, always analyzing the data that the world presented to her trained mind. That first evening, British sailors came to the cabins and told the women in a mixture of broken German and hand gestures to follow them to the dining area. The women walked in silence through the narrow hallways of the ship. None of them spoke. They were too nervous, too uncertain about what was coming next, too afraid that speaking would somehow jinx whatever small mercy they were being shown. They entered a large room filled with tables and chairs bolted to the floor so they would not slide when the ship rolled in heavy seas. The smell hit them first before they even saw the food, before they understood what was happening. The smell of bread baking, fresh bread, the kind made with real flour instead of the sawdust mixture that Germany had been using for the past year to stretch their dwindling supplies. Kate's stomach growled so loudly that Anna heard it and almost laughed despite her tears, a small sound that died quickly in the heavy air of confusion and fear and desperate hope. British sailors served them dinner on metal trays. The trays were divided into sections to keep different foods from touching. Kate stared at her tray for a long moment, counting everything on it with the careful attention of someone who had not seen real food in months. 2 slices of white bread, real butter, yellow and soft, not the gray margarine substitute they had been eating. A cup of coffee that smelled like actual coffee beans, not the roasted grain mixture that Germany called coffee now. A piece of fish with white flaky meat, boiled potatoes, a small bowl of canned peaches swimming in sweet syrup. She picked up one slice of bread and touched the butter with her finger. It was soft. It was real. It was butter like her mother used to buy before the war. Before everything changed, before butter became a luxury that only the wealthy and well-connected could afford. Anna ate slowly, like she was afraid the food would be taken away if she moved too fast or enjoyed it too much. She whispered to Kate in a voice so soft it was almost inaudible over the sound of hundreds of women eating. "This is better than what we ate in Tunisia for months." Kate nodded because she could not speak around the lump in her throat. It was better than what German soldiers ate anywhere in the entire Wehrmacht. The propaganda had said the British were starving because of German U-boats sinking their supply ships. The propaganda had shown pictures of British citizens with hollow cheeks and empty plates. But these people, these enemies, were feeding their prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. The next morning brought another surprise that made the confusion deepen into something close to panic. Breakfast. 3 meals a day, every single day. Breakfast was porridge with milk and sugar bread with jam and tea that tasted like real tea instead of dried leaves scraped from the bottom of old barrels. Kate pulled out the small diary she kept hidden in the inner pocket of her dress. The guards had not found it during the search because it was so small, just a notebook the size of her palm with pages thin as tissue paper. She wrote the date and then the words that would not leave her mind. They give us more food than our own army gave us. Why? The question had no answer. Not one that made sense within the framework of everything she had been taught about the enemy. During the day, the women were allowed on certain parts of the deck for fresh air and exercise. Greta noticed things because noticing was what she did, what she had been trained to do in her work analyzing propaganda. She watched the British guards walking past, and she saw that their boots were raw leather well made with thick soles and proper laces. No cardboard filling, no holes covered with wire. German soldiers in Tunisia had worn boots that fell apart in the sand, boots held together with scavenged wire and prayers and stubbornness, because there were no replacement parts, no new boots being shipped from factories that were too busy making other things. But these enemy guards, these men who were supposed to be suffering from German military superiority, had better equipment than German officers. On the third day of the voyage, a British medical officer came to examine all the women. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He checked each woman methodically for diseases and injuries. He looked in their mouths and listened to their breathing and felt their necks for swollen glands. Then he gave each of them vitamin pills in a small paper cup, watching to make sure they swallowed. Vitamins pills. Kate almost laughed out loud, but caught herself just in time. The sound died in her throat and came out as a strange choking noise that made the doctor look at her with concern. The German army could not get vitamins for soldiers dying of malnutrition in Russia. Wehrmacht troops in Tunisia had developed scurvy from lack of fresh vegetables, had gone night blind from vitamin deficiency, had lost teeth and developed bleeding gums, and watched their bodies slowly fail because there were no vitamins available anywhere in the supply chain. But the British were giving vitamin pills to prisoners, to enemies, to people who had been trying to kill them just weeks ago. Kate swallowed the pill and felt it go down her throat and wondered what kind of war this was, where the enemy cared more about keeping prisoners healthy than her own government had cared about keeping its soldiers alive. The ship sailed for 3 weeks across the Atlantic Ocean. Every day brought 3 full meals. Every night brought clean beds and blankets. The British guards were firm and professional, but never cruel. They did not touch the women. They did not make threats. They did not do any of the things that the propaganda had promised they would do. They just watched and made sure nobody tried to escape, which would have been impossible anyway, because where would anyone escape to in the middle of the ocean? One evening, Anna overheard 2 British guards talking near the railing where she was standing. They were complaining about the food in voices loud enough that they clearly did not care who heard them. One guard said the rations were boring the same thing every single day. Nothing interesting or flavorful or worth looking forward to. Boring. Anna wanted to scream at them. She was eating better on this prison ship than she had eaten in a year. Better than her mother was eating back in Bavaria. Better than Johann was eating if he was still alive somewhere in the frozen hell of the Russian front. And these men, these well-fed, healthy, comfortable men, called it boring. She lay in her bed that night trying to understand how rich this country must be, how abundant their resources, how different their reality from everything she had been told. How rich was a nation where guards complained about good food? What kind of place was this, where even prisoners ate like wealthy people? Greta sat with Kate one afternoon on the deck, both of them staring out at the ocean that stretched in every direction like infinity made visible. The water was blue and endless and beautiful in a way that made Kate's chest hurt with an emotion she could not name. Greta spoke quietly, her voice almost lost in the sound of wind and waves in the ship's engine. They treat us like humans. The propaganda said they would treat us like animals. Which one is the lie? Kate had no answer, but she was starting to think that everything might be a lie, that the foundation of her entire understanding of the world might be sand instead of stone, might be propaganda instead of truth. On June 19, 1943, the ship finally reached Halifax, Canada. The women were told to gather their few belongings, the small bags of personal items they had been allowed to keep. They were led off the ship onto a dock bustling with activity. Canada, a new world, a place that existed only in geography books and vague propaganda descriptions that painted it as a frozen wasteland of poverty and British oppression. But the dock looked busy and organized and clean. No bomb damage, no ruins. Everything was whole and functioning and moving with the efficiency of a place that had never been touched by war. British and Canadian soldiers loaded the women onto trains, long passenger trains with windows and seats, and the kind of comfort that seemed impossible for prisoners. The women climbed aboard and found seats with real cushions. Through the windows, Kate could see the city of Halifax spreading out around them. Buildings stood tall and undamaged. Shops had goods displayed in their windows. People walked the streets in clean clothes that looked new, or at least well-maintained. Nobody looked hungry. Nobody looked scared. Nobody looked like they were living in a country at war. The train started moving west, pulling away from the coast and heading into the vast interior of a continent that none of them had ever seen before. For days, they traveled across Canada, crossing distances that made Kate dizzy when she tried to comprehend them. Germany could fit inside this country multiple times. The scale was impossible. Greta pressed her face to the window and watched everything with those analytical eyes, taking mental notes, measuring and comparing, and trying to understand what she was seeing. Forests went on forever, thick and green and untouched by fire or bombs. Farmland stretched to the horizon in fields so huge they made Bavaria's farms look like garden plots. Towns and cities passed by, and every single one was whole. Not one bomb crater, not one ruined building, not one sign that war had ever touched this place. At night, lights blazed in every window of every town they passed. No blackouts, no fear of bombers, no need to hide in the darkness and pray that death would pass overhead without noticing you. Every station they stopped at had shops full of goods. People stood on platforms looking well-fed and healthy and normal, like the war was something happening far away to someone else. Anna whispered in a voice tight with realization and fear, "They are not even afraid. The war has not touched them at all." Greta watched everything and said nothing, but Kate saw her writing in a small notebook, filling pages with observations and calculations that would later help her understand just how thoroughly they had all been lied to. Something was very wrong with what they had been taught about the enemy, or something was very right with this strange, abundant, untouched country that spoke English and fed its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers fighting and dying in Russia and Africa and all across Europe. The train carried them deeper into a reality that contradicted everything they thought they knew. And with each mile, each town, each glimpse of abundance and normalcy, the propaganda crumbled a little more. The lies became more obvious. The truth became harder to deny. They were heading toward a city called Milwaukee in a state called Wisconsin, in a country that was about to teach them what freedom actually meant. June 22nd, 1943. The train slowed in the late afternoon, wheels screeching against rails as the massive engine pulled hundreds of tons of steel and human cargo toward its final destination. Greta looked out the window and saw a small station ahead, wood and brick, painted in colors that looked too bright, too clean, too untouched by war. The other women started gathering their belongings, the few possessions they had been allowed to keep, thinking this might be their final stop after days of endless travel through a country that seemed to have no end. The train hissed and squealed as it came to a complete halt. Through the window, Kate could see a wooden sign hanging above the platform. She read it out loud to Anna and Greta, her voice uncertain, testing the English words carefully. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The doors opened with a metallic clang, and Canadian guards told them in a mixture of English and broken German to step out onto the platform. All 847 women climbed down from the train cars, blinking in the bright June sunshine that felt different, cleaner, somehow less hostile than the burning African sun they had left behind. The air smelled different too, fresh and green like grass and trees and growing things like life instead of sand and death, and the metallic taste of fear. A man in a neat uniform walked toward them across the platform. He looked like a station master official and proper, with a clipboard in his hands and the bearing of someone who took his job seriously. He stopped in front of the group of confused, exhausted German women and opened his mouth to speak. "Willkommen in Milwaukee. Bitte folgen Sie mir." "Welcome to Milwaukee. Please follow me." In German, perfect German, not the halting, uncertain German of someone who had learned it in school from textbooks. This was real German, flowing and natural, spoken with a Bavarian accent that sounded exactly like the way Anna's grandmother talked back in her village in the mountains. Every single woman froze. 847 women stood completely still on the platform, staring at this American man speaking their language, like he had been born to it. The shock was physical, like being slapped across the face with cold water. Kate's mind went blank for a moment, unable to process what she was hearing. Anna grabbed Kate's arm so hard it hurt her fingers digging into the flesh, hard enough to leave bruises. She whispered in a voice that shook with confusion and something close to panic. Is this a trick A test? Are they trying to catch us saying something we should not say? Greta's eyes went sharp and focused the look she got when she was analyzing something, taking it apart to understand how it worked. She listened carefully to the way the man spoke, to his accent and his word choices and the rhythm of his sentences. She turned to Kate and said quietly, urgently, needing them to understand. That is a Bavarian accent from southern Germany, not someone who learned German in school. He grew up speaking it. That is his native dialect. More people appeared on the platform now. Local civilians coming to watch the prisoners arrive, curious about the German women who had been captured in Africa and brought halfway around the world. Two women stood near a bench talking to each other in rapid German, their voices carrying across the platform. Then one of them turned to speak to a man and switched to English in the middle of a sentence, back and forth between languages, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like speaking two languages was as normal as breathing. An older man walked past, pushing a cart loaded with luggage. He was humming a song under his breath, not paying attention to the crowd of women or the guards or the general confusion. Kate recognized the song immediately. It was a folk song from the Rhine Valley, a song about rivers and vineyards and the beauty of the German countryside. Her father used to sing it on Sunday mornings when he was in a good mood, when business at the shop was good and the world seemed bright and full of possibility. This American man, this stranger in a foreign country, was humming her father's song while he worked. Anna looked at Kate with wide, frightened eyes that were filling with tears again. Are we in the wrong country? Did the ship take us to Germany by mistake? But that made no sense. The signs were in English. The flags hanging from buildings were Canadian and American, red and white stripes and stars and maple leaves, nothing German anywhere. They were definitely in North America, definitely thousands of miles from home. So why did everyone speak German? Why did this place sound like home when it was supposed to be the heart of enemy territory? The station master led them down the main street, away from the train platform, and into the city itself. Kate looked at everything as they walked, her eyes trying to take in all the details at once. A newspaper stand on the corner had papers in two languages side by side. She could read the German one clearly. Der Deutscher Amerikaner, the German American, a German-language newspaper published here in America in the middle of a war against Germany. Her head started to hurt from trying to understand what that meant. They passed a church, a tall brick building with a white steeple pointing up at the blue sky. The sign out front had words in both English and German. Sunday service 10:00 a.m., and below it, Sonntagsgottesdienst 10 Uhr. The same information in two languages, like both were equally normal here. Like speaking German in America was not something to hide or be ashamed of or fear punishment for. Street signs caught her eye as they walked deeper into the city. Friedrich Street, Goethe Street, Wilhelm Street, German names on American streets. She looked at Greta and saw that she had noticed too. The older woman said nothing, but Kate saw her hand moving, writing in that small notebook again, recording everything for later analysis. The guards led all 847 women to a large brick building complex that looked like a school or university. The station master explained in his perfect Bavarian German that this was Marquette University, a Catholic school. The students were gone for summer break, so the women would stay here in the dormitories until more permanent arrangements could be made. A priest came out to greet them. He was an old man with white hair and a kind face lined with wrinkles that spoke of years of smiling and caring for people. He spoke to them in German with a Swabian accent, the same accent that Anna's grandmother had back in her village in Bavaria, the same rounded vowels and soft consonants that Anna associated with safety and home and her childhood before the war. Anna started crying again. Not from fear this time, but from confusion so deep it felt like drowning. Nothing made sense anymore. Nothing fit with what she had been taught about America, about the enemy, about how the world worked. The priest patted her shoulder gently and said, in that familiar, comforting Swabian German, "You are safe here, child. No harm will come to you." Inside the building, American women volunteers showed them to large rooms filled with beds. Real beds with real mattresses, not straw, not blankets on the floor. Actual mattresses with springs that gave when you sat on them, and sheets that smelled like soap and sunshine. Greta sat on a bed and it was soft. She had slept on hard ground for so long that soft felt strange, almost wrong, like something her body had forgotten how to recognize. An American woman showed them the bathroom, a tiled room with sinks and toilets and showers. She turned on a tap and steam rose from the water like magic. Hot water. Running hot water that came out whenever you wanted it, as much as you needed, unlimited and free. Anna reached out and touched the stream of water, then jerked her hand back because it was actually hot enough to burn if you were not careful. The woman smiled and said in German, in that same comfortable, natural German that everyone here seemed to speak. First hot shower in a while, yes, take your time. We have plenty of hot water. Plenty. That word again. Kate had heard it on the ship. She was hearing it here. Plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of everything. While back in Germany, her mother stood in line for hours to get a few hundred grams of flour and some artificial fat that tasted like chemicals. That evening, they were led to a huge dining hall, a room that could seat 900 people easily. Long tables stretched in rows across the polished floor. The smell of cooking food made Kate's mouth water, instantly, involuntarily her body responding to the promise of real food before her mind could catch up. Real food, meat cooking, bread baking, butter melting, onions frying. The smells were so rich and overwhelming after months of thin soup and dry bread that Kate felt dizzy. American women in aprons brought out plates of food and set them on the tables. Kate looked at her plate and could not breathe for a moment, could not process what she was seeing. Roast beef. A thick slice of actual beef, browned on the outside and pink in the middle with juices running across the plate. Mashed potatoes with gravy rich and creamy and steaming. Carrots glazed with butter and herbs. 2 slices of white bread with real yellow butter already melting into the warm surface. A glass of milk, cold and white and fresh. A piece of apple pie for dessert sitting there like a promise of sweetness to come. She picked up her fork and cut into the meat. The knife slid through easily. She counted silently while she ate, unable to stop herself from calculating. The piece of beef on her plate weighed about 427 grams. She knew because she used to help her father weigh goods in a shop before the war, before everything closed down. 427 grams of meat. Wehrmacht rations in Africa had been 200 grams of meat per week. Per week, 7 days. And that was when supplies were good, when the ships got through, when the rations actually arrived instead of being lost to Allied bombers or submarine attacks or simple bureaucratic failure. She was eating more than twice a week's ration in one meal. One single meal. Anna ate her pie slowly, making each bite last as long as possible, letting it melt on her tongue. She had not tasted real apples in over a year. The apples were sweet, and the crust was made with real butter. You could taste it. You could feel it in the flaky texture that dissolved in your mouth like edible clouds. At the next table, 2 local women were talking in German, complaining about something. Kate heard them and listened despite herself, despite knowing she should focus on her own food and not pay attention to civilian conversations. One woman said in a voice full of frustration and annoyance, "Only 450 grams of meat this week with the rationing. How am I supposed to feed my family?" The other woman agreed, nodding sympathetically. "It is terrible. My husband loves his pot roast and I cannot make it properly with so little." Kate wanted to laugh or cry or scream. She did not know which emotion was appropriate for this moment. German civilians back home in Germany got 250 grams per week if they were lucky, if the rations came through, if the distribution system had not collapsed in their area. Most got less, many got nothing. People were starving in Hamburg and Berlin and Munich, eating sawdust bread and watered-down soup and whatever they could scavenge from bombed-out buildings. And these American women with their German last names and their comfortable lives were complaining about getting more meat than Germans ever saw. That night, lying in a real bed under clean sheets, Kate tried to make sense of everything. Her mind went in circles, chasing explanations that did not quite work, trying to fit the evidence into the framework of what she had been taught. This must be a special camp, she decided, set up for propaganda purposes, to make them think America was rich and wonderful and generous. This could not be real. This could not be normal life here. It had to be fake, a carefully constructed illusion designed to break their spirits and make them doubt their loyalty to Germany. It had to be fake. But Greta sat on her bed in the dim light writing in her notebook, page after page of observations and calculations. She was adding things up, counting and measuring and thinking with that trained analytical mind that had once worked for Luftwaffe intelligence. Kate could see her face in the lamplight, could see the concentration in the slowly dawning horror as the numbers told a story that could not be denied. Anna just stared at the ceiling, her eyes open and unblinking. She was too overwhelmed to even process what was happening. Everything she thought she knew about the enemy was wrong. Everything the propaganda had told her was a lie. Everything her government had promised was false. And that was more terrifying than any torture could have been. Because if this was wrong, if the propaganda lied about this, then what else was false? How much of her understanding of the world was built on lies? How many of the things she believed were true were actually manufactured stories designed to make her compliant and obedient and willing to sacrifice everything for a cause that did not care about her at all? July 1943. The American authorities decided that the German women prisoners would work. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be assigned to work as long as it was not war work, not making weapons or building military equipment or doing anything that directly contributed to the enemy's ability to fight. But farm work was allowed, factory work was allowed, service work was allowed, and America needed workers because so many American men had gone overseas to fight in Europe and the Pacific, leaving holes in the workforce that needed to be filled. Kate and Anna were assigned to work at a meat processing plant in Milwaukee. The name of the company was Schmidt and Sons Meats. When Anna heard the name, she laughed for the first time in months, a real laugh that surprised her with its sound. Schmidt was a common German name, as common as Mueller or Weber or any of the other names that half the women in their group carried. Even the businesses here had German names. Greta was assigned to work at the local hospital as a translator. Because she spoke 3 languages and was educated and professional, they needed her to help German-speaking patients communicate with English-speaking doctors. The hospital was happy to have her. They treated her like a professional colleague, not like a prisoner, not like an enemy. American veteran guards watched over the prisoners, older men who had fought in the First World War and were too old now to go fight in this new war. So they guarded prisoners instead, doing their duty in the only way their aging bodies allowed. Many of these guards were also of German descent. Their grandparents had come from Germany 50 or 60 years ago, before the wars, before the hatred, when people could move freely across the ocean seeking better lives. The guards spoke some German words they had learned from their parents mixed with English, in the easy, natural way that Americans seem to do. On her first day at Schmidt and Sons Meats, Kate walked into the processing plant and stopped in the doorway, frozen by what she saw. The building was huge, a cathedral of industry. Metal machines lined the walls, gleaming and new and efficient. Electric refrigerators kept the meat cold, huge rooms where entire sides of beef hung from hooks. Everything was modern and clean and looked like it had been built yesterday instead of decades ago. She had worked in a factory in Hamburg before the war, before she joined the Luftwaffe. That factory had old equipment that broke down constantly, machines that dated from before the First World War, kept running through improvisation and prayer. They never had spare parts to fix anything properly. When something broke, you patched it together with wire and hope and kept going until it broke again. This American factory looked like it came from the future. A woman walked up to Kate and spoke in German, that same comfortable, natural German that everyone here seemed to speak. "You must be one of the new workers. I am Elizabeth Schmidt. I will show you what to do." Mrs. Schmidt was about 50 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and strong hands that looked like they had been working with meat for decades. She spoke German with a Hamburg accent, the exact same accent that Kate had, the accent of the port city where Kate had grown up. Kate could not help herself. The question came out before she could stop it. "You are from Hamburg." Mrs. Schmidt smiled, a warm expression that reached her eyes. "My grandparents were from Hamburg. They came to America in 1870, before I was born. I was born here in Milwaukee, but my grandmother taught me to speak proper Hamburg German. She said I should never forget where we came from, where our family started, what our heritage meant." They worked side by side, cutting and packaging meat. The plant processed 2,000 hogs every single week. 2,000. Kate tried to imagine that much meat and could not. In Hamburg, people waited in lines for hours, sometimes all day, to get a small piece of pork. Here, mountains of meat moved through the factory every single day, more meat than she had seen in her entire life before coming to America. During their morning break, the workers were allowed to eat sausages. Free sausages from the production line as much as they wanted, fresh and hot and perfectly seasoned. Kate watched American workers grab sausages and eat them like it was nothing special. Like free meat was such a normal part of their lives that it did not even register as abundance. She took one small sausage and ate it slowly, letting each bite last. It tasted like real meat with real spices, pork and sage and pepper. Not the mystery meat mixed with breadcrumbs and sawdust that Germany called sausage now. This was what sausage used to taste like before the war, before the shortages, before everything good became rare and precious. At lunch, Mrs. Schmidt sat with Kate and opened a letter that had arrived that morning. From Germany, from Hamburg, from her cousin, who still lived in the old neighborhood where the Schmidt family had started generations ago. The Schmidt's face grew sad as she read the light going out of her eyes. She looked up at Kate when she finished reading. She says they are starving in Hamburg. No meat, no butter, barely any bread. The bombing is constant. Every night the planes come and the city burns and people die. She paused, looking at Kate with an expression that held both sympathy and terrible knowledge. You are from Hamburg, too. Kate nodded. She felt tears starting, but pushed them back down, swallowed them, forced them away, because crying would not help anything. Yes, my family lives there. Lived there. I do not know anymore. I have not heard anything in months. Mrs. Schmidt reached across the table and touched Kate's hand, a gesture of comfort from a stranger who understood loss. I will pray for them. I pray for all of them. My cousin, your family, everyone trapped in that burning city. Kate looked at this woman, this enemy, who was not an enemy at all. Same German heritage, same language, same city of origin. But Mrs. Schmidt lived in abundance and safety while her cousins starved and waited to die in the rubble of Hamburg. The only difference between them was an ocean and a choice that their grandparents had made 70 years ago. One family had stayed in Germany, one family had left for America, and that single choice had determined everything that came after. Life or death, freedom or oppression, truth or lies. That was all it took. One choice made by people long dead that saved some and doomed others. Meanwhile, Anna was sent to live and work on a farm outside the city. The family name was Wagner. When Anna heard it, she smiled because Wagner was close to Müller, both good German names, both common in Bavaria. The coincidence felt like a small mercy in a world that had become incomprehensible. The Wagner family owned 160 acres of land, 160 acres. Anna's family farm in Bavaria was 40 acres, and people in her village called it a large farm, one of the bigger operations in the area. This American farm was 4 times bigger than what she had thought of as large. The Wagner family had 2 automobiles, 2 cars sitting in the barn like it was normal to own multiple vehicles. One for work, driving to town and hauling supplies. One for Sunday drives for pleasure, for taking the family to church or visiting relatives. They had electric milking machines in the barn, modern equipment that did the work of 3 men. They had a radio in the living room, a big wooden cabinet that brought news and music and entertainment into their home every evening. They had a telephone mounted on the wall in the kitchen, a device that let them talk to people miles away without leaving the house. Anna stared at these things like they were artifacts from an alien civilization. This was wealth beyond anything she had imagined. This was abundance that seemed impossible, excessive, wasteful even. How could one family need 2 cars? How could farmers afford electric machines? Who were these people? Mr. Wagner was kind but serious, a man who worked hard and expected the same from everyone around him. His 3 sons were all overseas, fighting with the American army, one in Italy, one in the Pacific, one in England, preparing for something big that no one was allowed to talk about. His wife, Mrs. Wagner, spoke German with a Bavarian accent because her parents had come from Bavaria 2 generations ago. She treated Anna like a guest, not a prisoner. She gave her a clean room with a real bed. She fed her the same food the family ate. On Sunday, Mrs. Wagner invited Anna to join them for dinner. It was not a command, it was an invitation. Anna could have refused, but she did not want to refuse because she was lonely and homesick and desperately needed to feel like a human being instead of a prisoner. roast chicken with herb stuffing, potatoes with real butter melting in golden pools, fresh vegetables from the garden picked that morning while the dew was still on the leaves, apple cake for dessert made with real sugar and real eggs and real butter ingredients that Anna had not seen together in one recipe since before the war started. Anna ate carefully, trying not to look like she was starving, even though part of her still felt hungry all the time, a hunger that went deeper than her stomach, a hunger for normalcy and safety and the life she used to have. Mrs. Wagner noticed anyway because mothers always notice when young women are not eating enough. She put more food on Anna's plate without asking, without making it seem like charity or pity. Eat, child. You are too thin. We have plenty. Plenty. There was that word again. They had plenty while their three sons fought a war against Anna's country. Her family had nothing while her brother Johann, if he was still alive, fought the same war from the other side. How could this be? How could the enemy have plenty while the superior German nation starved? The question had no answer that fit with what she had been taught. At the hospital, Greta worked with doctors and nurses who treated her like a professional colleague. She translated for old German-speaking patients who had never learned English, immigrants who had come to America decades ago but had always lived in German-speaking communities where English was not necessary. One day she was translating for an elderly woman who needed surgery, a routine procedure that would save her life. The woman's chart said she had three sons. All three served in the American Army. All three were fighting against Germany right now, somewhere in Europe or the Pacific or North Africa, fighting against the country where their mother had been born. Greta had to ask. The question burned in her mind until she could not hold it back anymore. Your sons fight for America, but you speak German at home. The old woman looked at her with tired eyes that had seen too much eyes that understood things Greta was only beginning to grasp. We speak German because it is our language. We are American because this is our country. You can be both. My sons love their heritage and they love their country. They are not fighting for Germany. They are fighting against the Nazis. Greta felt something crack inside her chest, a barrier breaking that she had not known was there. The propaganda had taught her that being German meant being loyal to the Nazi party, that loving your country meant following the Führer, that heritage and politics were inseparable, welded together into one unified identity. But this old woman was proving that wrong. You could be German and still be free. You could love your language and culture without loving the government that had corrupted both. You could preserve your heritage while rejecting the evil done in its name. This idea was new and revolutionary and terrifying in what it meant for everything Greta had believed. At night, the women gathered back at Marquette University in their dormitory rooms. They talked quietly about what they saw during the day, sharing observations and trying to make sense of experiences that did not fit any framework they had been given. Kate told them about the meat factory. They waste more meat and trimmings than we see in a month back home. The workers snack on sausages during breaks like it is nothing. Free sausages, as much as they want. Anna talked about the Wagner farm. They have two cars, and electric machines that do the work of multiple men, and a telephone. My family in Bavaria does not even have electricity in the barn yet. We still milk cows by hand because we cannot afford machines. Another woman named Helga, who worked at a furniture factory, spoke up. The machines never break down because they have spare parts for everything. Everything. When something breaks, they fix it the same day, sometimes the same hour. In Germany, we waited months for parts that never came. Here they just order new parts and they arrive and everything works again. Some of the younger women started crying. One girl, barely 18, said in a voice breaking with emotion, "My brother is in Russia eating frozen bread and fighting with a rifle that jams every third shot because we do not have the parts to maintain it properly." Why are we so poor and they are so rich? Greta spoke up quietly from her corner of the room. She had been listening to everything, processing it all with that analytical mind. Because they are not spending everything on war. They send men to fight, yes, but their economy still works. Their people still eat. Their factories still produce civilian goods. They built a country that can afford to fight and still take care of home. An older woman named Hilda, one of the resistors who refused to believe what she was seeing, got angry. Her face flushed red and her voice rose sharp and cutting. "This is propaganda. All of it. They are trying to break us to make us doubt. This is all fake." staged, designed to weaken our resolve. But Kate shook her head, certainty growing in her chest like a weight. It is not fake. The German families here get letters from Germany, real letters from their relatives. I heard Mrs. Schmidt reading one today. Everyone there is starving, while everyone here complains about rationing that gives them more food than German soldiers get. The soldiers fighting for us. The men dying for the fatherland. They eat worse than prisoners. The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke, choking and undeniable. The women wrote letters home when they were finally allowed, but the American authorities read every letter before sending it. Nothing sensitive could be revealed, nothing that might compromise security or give information to the enemy. Everything had to pass through censors who crossed out words and phrases and entire paragraphs with thick black ink. Kate wrote to her mother. The censored version that made it through said simple, safe things. Dear Mother, I am well. The work is not hard. The food is good. I pray for you every day. America is not what we were told. The people here are kind. I hope this letter finds you safe. Your loving daughter, Catherine. What she wanted to write but could not, what the censors would have destroyed before it ever left Milwaukee, was this. Mother, we were lied to about everything. The enemy is not barbaric. They are not cruel. They treat us better than our own army ever did. I do not know if we are fighting for the right side. I think maybe we are the bad ones. I am so confused and scared, and I do not know what truth is anymore. But that truth had to stay in her diary, the small notebook she kept hidden under her mattress, the pages where she wrote everything honestly, without fear of censors or punishment, or anyone reading her words except her future self. November 1944. The American Guards did something that shocked every single woman who witnessed it. They allowed the prisoners to watch Americans vote in the presidential election. Franklin Delano Roosevelt against Thomas Dewey, Democrat against Republican. Two men fighting for control of the government while the country fought a war on two fronts across two oceans. The women watched from windows and doorways as American citizens lined up at polling places. They watched people argue about politics in the streets, voices raised in passionate disagreement about who would make the better president. They watched newspapers print articles supporting different candidates, criticizing the current leadership, questioning decisions and policies in the entire direction of the country, and nobody was arrested. Nobody disappeared in the night. Nobody was sent to camps for speaking against the government. Kate stood with Greta watching a polling station across the street from the meat processing plant. She saw people of all kinds voting, rich and poor, young and old, men in suits and men in work clothes covered in grease and dirt, all of them participating in the decision about who would lead their country. Greta said quietly, her voice full of wonder and pain, in Germany we had elections too, but only one choice, one party, one result predetermined before anyone cast a ballot. This is real democracy. This is what it actually looks like when people choose instead of being told. Two American guards stood near them, also watching the voting. The guards were arguing about the election, their voices friendly but heated. One supported Roosevelt, one supported Dewey. They disagreed completely about who should be president. But after they finished arguing, they laughed and went back to work together. Still friends, still colleagues, their disagreement changing nothing about their relationship. This was impossible according to everything Kate had been taught. Disagreement meant disloyalty. Criticism meant treason. Different opinions meant division and weakness and the collapse of national unity. But here disagreement was normal, expected, even encouraged. Kate started asking Mrs. Schmidt questions during their breaks at the meat factory. Questions she would never have dared to ask in Germany, questions that would have gotten her reported to the Gestapo. How can you criticize your government and not be arrested? Mrs. Schmidt looked at her with surprise, like the question itself revealed something tragic. That is what freedom means, Kate. The government works for us, not the other way around. If they do a bad job, we vote them out. If they make bad decisions, we tell them so in newspapers and on the radio and in public meetings. They serve us. We do not serve them. Kate's mind struggled with this concept like trying to understand a foreign language with no translation. Government works for the people, not people working for the government. The entire hierarchy was inverted backwards from everything she knew. December 1904, Mrs. Schmidt received a letter from her cousin in Hamburg. The envelope was thin, the paper cheap, rationed like everything else in Germany. Mrs. Schmidt opened it during lunch break with hands that trembled slightly. She read it in silence, her face going pale, her eyes filling with tears. When she finished, she handed the letter to Kate without saying anything. Just handed it across the table and waited. Kate read on. The words were simple, but they hit like physical blows. December 3rd, 1904. Dear Elizabeth, the bombing last week destroyed our entire block. We live in the basement now, what is left of it. Mother died in November. The doctor said starvation, but really she just gave up. She gave her ration card to the children so they could eat. We have no heat, no windows. The cold is worse than the hunger. You cannot imagine the cold when you have no heat and no walls, and the winter wind blows through the ruins. You wrote me about the German prisoner working at your factory. Tell her something for me. Tell her she is lucky. Lucky to be captured. Lucky to be fed. Lucky to be warm. Lucky to be alive. If I could surrender to the Americans, I would do it today, right now. But there is no front line here. Just bombs falling from the sky and hunger eating us from the inside and waiting to die. Tell your prisoner this. Tell her family to surrender if they can. This war is lost. Germany is dead. We are just the corpses that have not stopped moving yet. Your cousin, Margaret. Kate could not breathe, could not speak, could not process what she had just read. Mrs. Schmidt's cousin lived in the same neighborhood where Kate's family lived. The same street, the same shops. They probably knew each other. They probably stood in the same food lines together waiting for rations that would not keep them alive. You are lucky to be captured. Lucky to be a prisoner. Lucky to be an enemy in enemy hands. Lucky. The word destroyed something inside Katie's chest, some last remaining piece of her belief in the peace in the fatherland, in the promises that had sent her to North Africa, to send radio messages for an army that abandoned her when retreat came. Mrs. Schmidt was crying now, tears running down her face unchecked. I will sponsor you to stay in America after the war ends. You can work here permanently. Bring your family if they survive. You do not have to go back to that hell. Kate felt her own tears starting hot and painful. My mother is there. I cannot abandon her. I have to go back. I have to find her. Mrs. Schmidt reached across and took both of Kate's hands in hers. Then we pray as she survives, and we send packages when we can, and we hope that hope is enough. That night, Kate wrote in her diary with shaking hands, December 5th, 1944, Mrs. Schmidt's cousin says I am lucky to be captured. I am eating roast beef while her mother starved to death, giving her ration card to children. I am warm while they freeze in a basement with no walls. I am alive while they wait to die. The Führer promised us glory and gave us ashes. He promised us greatness and gave us mass graves. I do not know if I can forgive myself for believing the lies, but I know I can never believe them again. The propaganda is dead inside me. It died when I read that letter. Now I just feel empty where the certainty used to be. May 7th, 1945. The guards called all 847 women to gather in the main hall at Marquette University. They had done this before for important announcements, but this time something felt different. The air was electric with anticipation and fear and hope, all mixed together into something that made breathing difficult. The radio was turned up loud so everyone could hear. The women stood in silence waiting. Then the announcement came crackling through the speakers in a voice that tried to sound triumphant, but just sounded tired. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The room stayed silent for a long moment as the words sank in as their meaning became real. Then some women started crying. Others collapsed into chairs, their legs giving out under the weight of relief and grief and confusion about what this meant. A few smiled tentative expressions of hope that peace had finally come. Most just stood there trying to process the information, trying to understand what the end of the war meant for them personally. Kate felt her knees go weak. She sat down hard on the floor, not making it to a chair, just sitting where she stood because standing was no longer possible. The war was over. 6 years of fighting, 6 years of death and destruction and lies. 6 years of the world tearing itself apart. Over. Thank God, she whispered. Thank God it is over. Anna cried from relief so strong it felt like pain, a physical sensation in her chest that she could not control. Maybe Johann had survived. Maybe her brother was alive somewhere in a Russian prisoner of war camp. Maybe the dying would stop now. Maybe people could start living again instead of just surviving. Greta stood with her arms crossed, her face carefully blank, revealing nothing. But inside, she was thinking about what came next. Germany had lost. The Nazi regime was finished, destroyed, erased from power. What would happen to Germany now? What would happen to the German people? What would happen to all of them? These 847 women who had been captured and brought to America and shown a different way of living. In the following weeks, news came from Germany. It was worse than anyone had imagined possible. Berlin was rubble, a city of ruins where buildings had been, and now only broken stone remained. Hamburg was destroyed, burned, and bombed until it was barely recognizable. Munich, Frankfurt, Cologne, every major city reduced to debris and ash. Millions of people were displaced, homeless, wandering through the ruins, looking for family members who were probably dead. Starvation was everywhere. Disease was spreading. The entire country had collapsed into chaos. The American government began planning for repatriation, for sending prisoners home now that the war was over. But they gave the women something unexpected, something generous that none of them had anticipated. They gave them a choice. They could return to Germany if they wanted, or they could apply to stay in America. If they stayed, they would need a sponsor, someone willing to vouch for them. They would need it all. They would need to pass security screening to make sure they were not dangerous, not war criminals, not people who had committed atrocities. But if they met those requirements, they could stay. They could build new lives in America. They could become Americans themselves eventually through the long process of naturalization and citizenship. This choice tore the 847 women apart more thoroughly than any battlefield ever could. Stay in the country that had been their enemy or return to the homeland that had lied to them. Both options felt wrong and right at the same time. Both carried pain and possibility in equal measure. Kate decided to return. She had to find her mother. Had to know if her family had survived the bombing and the starvation and the collapse of everything. Even though Germany was destroyed, it was still home. She could not abandon her mother, could not live with the guilt of staying safe in America while her family struggled in the ruins. She promised Mrs. Schmidt she would send letters telling her if she arrived safely, if she found her family, if there was anything left of the Hamburg they both loved. Mrs. Schmidt gave her a package to take, a thick envelope full of things that might save lives. Food, money, addresses of relief organizations, letters to deliver to her cousin Margareta, and a promise written on paper and sealed with tears. If you want to come back to America, I will sponsor you. You have family here now too. Remember that. Anna chose to stay. The Wagner family had offered to sponsor her, to give her a job on the farm to help her through the citizenship process. When Anna told Mrs. Wagner her decision, the older woman hugged her and cried tears of joy and relief and maternal love for this young woman who had become like a daughter. You are family now, Mrs. Wagner said, her voice thick with emotion. You will always have a home here. Anna thought about her village in Bavaria, thought about the small farm with no electricity, no machines, no abundance, thought about the future waiting there if anything was even left standing after the war. Then she thought about America with its plenty, its freedom, its possibilities. The choice was clear, even though it hurt to make it hurt, to admit that she was choosing the enemy's country over her own homeland. There is nothing left in Bavaria for me, she told Kate quietly one night as they sat together in the dormitory. Johann is probably dead. My family's farm is probably destroyed. The village is probably gone. Here I have a future. Here I have hope. I am staying. Greta also chose to stay. The hospital had offered her a permanent job as a translator and nurse. She had no family left in Berlin. The city was divided now between the Soviets and the Western Allies, cut in half like a body on an operating table. The Soviet zone was dangerous for anyone who had worked for the Nazi government in any capacity, even something as minor as sending radio signals. People were being arrested, sent to new camps, punished for their association with the regime, regardless of what they had actually done. Staying in America meant safety. It meant a chance to help other refugees who would be coming, people displaced by the war, who needed someone to translate their fears and hopes into English so they could start rebuilding their lives. But deeper than safety, deeper than the practical reasons Greta chose to stay because of redemption. She had stayed silent when she knew the propaganda was lies. She had chosen survival over speaking truth. Now she could spend the rest of her life helping Germans learn the truth, helping them understand what freedom actually meant, helping them rebuild their identity separate from the evil that had corrupted it. Of the 847 women, 300 decided to stay in America. The other 547 would return to Germany, would go back to the ruins, in the hunger, in the long, difficult process of rebuilding a country from ashes. October 1945, the German-American community in Milwaukee organized a farewell ceremony at the Concordia Club, the same building where the Oktoberfest had been held 2 years earlier. The same place where Kate had cried with an old man over his granddaughter in Hamburg. The same place where Anna had held hands with an American girl who feared for her brother the same way Anna feared for hers. Everyone came. The women who were leaving, the women who were staying. The German-American families who had helped them, fed them, showed them kindness when they were enemies. The American guards who had watched over them with professionalism and unexpected gentleness. There were tears and hugs and promises to write letters. Addresses were exchanged, written carefully on scraps of paper that would be kept in wallets, in dresser drawers, and treasured like valuable documents. The German-American community gave each woman returning to Germany a care package supplies that might mean the difference between life and death in the ruins. Kate opened her package that night in the dormitory. Inside were cans of food, canned meat, and vegetables and fruit that would not spoil. Bars of real soap, clean clothes that fit, medicine, aspirin and bandages and antiseptic. Things Germany did not have anymore. Things that had become precious and rare and worth more than money. The American Guard commander gave a short speech. He was a quiet man who had supervised the prisoners for 2 years without drama, without incident, with simple professional competence. He stood at the front of the hall and spoke in English while someone translated into German. "You were never our enemies," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Just people caught in a terrible war started by evil men. We wish you well wherever you go. We hope you find peace. We hope you remember that Americans can be kind, that we judge people by their character, not their nationality, that we believe in human dignity, even for those who fought against us." Kate hugged Mrs. Schmidt, both of them crying too hard to speak. Mrs. Schmidt pressed the thick envelope into Kate's hands, the letters and money and addresses that might save her cousin's life. "For Margaret, if you find her, tell her I love her. Tell her I pray for her every night. Tell her America is real, and if she can get here, I will bring her here." December 1940, the 547 women who chose to return boarded ships in New York Harbor. The journey was different from their arrival 2.5 years ago. They knew what waited for them now. Rubble, starvation, a broken country that would take decades to rebuild. But they were going anyway because family was there, because home was there, because some obligations went deeper than survival or comfort or even hope. What they physically carried were Red Cross parcels filled with food and clothes and medicine, letters of recommendation from their American employers, contact addresses of German-American families who had promised to help from across the ocean, photos and small mementos from their time in America, proof that it had been real, that the kindness had happened, that everything had not been a dream. What they mentally carried was harder to describe, heavier to bear, more transformative than any physical object. Knowledge that everything they had believed was false. Understanding of what real freedom meant when you had experienced it. Guilt about what Germany had done to the world, what evil had been committed in the name of the fatherland. Hope that Germany could rebuild on better principles, could learn from its mistakes, could become something new and better. Memories of kindness from people they had been taught to hate. Evidence that propaganda died when confronted with human decency. The certainty that truth was stronger than lies, even when lies had the power of a government behind them. The ship docked in Bremerhaven in January 1946. The women walked down the gangway into a country they barely recognized. The port was damaged buildings standing with walls missing and roofs collapsed. People shuffled past, looking thin and gray, and defeated, their eyes hollow with hunger and loss and the trauma of total war. German soldiers in ragged uniforms begged for food on the streets. Men who had fought for the fatherland reduced to begging from the same civilians they had sworn to protect. This was the great Germany that was supposed to rule the world for 1,000 years. This was the master race that was destined for glory and power and eternal dominance. Broken, starving, defeated, reduced to rubble and ash, and the bitter knowledge that everything had been lies. Kate took a train to Hamburg. The journey took 2 days because the rail lines were damaged, because bridges were down, because the entire infrastructure of the country had been systematically destroyed by years of Allied bombing. When she finally arrived in the city where she had grown up, she could not believe what her eyes were showing her. Hamburg was gone, not damaged, gone. Block after block of rubble stretching in every direction. Buildings burned to empty shells. Craters where streets used to be holes in the earth large enough to swallow vehicles. People living in basements of destroyed houses in holes covered with salvaged tin sheets in conditions worse than animals. She found her mother living in what remained of their old apartment building and just 2 rooms still standing in a structure that had once held 20 families. The walls were cracked. The windows were gone, covered with boards and cloth. There was no heat, no electricity, no running water. Her mother was alive, but barely. She weighed 43 kilograms, less than 100 pounds, her body reduced to skin and bone by years of starvation rations. Her clothes hung on her like they were draped over a skeleton. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow, her hands shaking with weakness. When Kate walked in carrying her Red Cross parcel, her mother stared like she was seeing a ghost, like the dead had returned from the grave. Kate dropped the parcel on the floor. It split open and cans of food rolled across the broken floorboards with metallic sounds that seemed too loud in the silence. Kate's mother fell to her knees and started crying. Real food, American food, food that might keep her alive for another month, another week, another day. Food that meant her daughter had not forgotten her, had come back, had survived the war. Kate knelt down and held her mother, feeling how thin she was, how fragile, how close to death. The first words she spoke were practical, immediate, focused on survival. Mama, I brought food. The second words were truth that needed to be said, confession that needed to be made. They lied to us about everything. Her mother just nodded, still crying, not surprised at all. I know. We all know now. Everyone in Germany knows. The lies became obvious when they could no longer hide the truth from us. Kate opened cans for her mother right there on the floor, canned peaches in syrup. The sound of the can opener cutting through tin made her mother flinch because it sounded like metal. On metal, like shrapnel, like the sounds of bombs in war. The smell of peaches filled the room, sweet and impossible, a fruit that had not been available in Germany for years. Her mother ate slowly, tears still running down her face, chewing carefully because her teeth were loose from malnutrition. Each bite was savored, held in her mouth, appreciated like something precious and rare. 3 days later, Kate found Margaret, Mrs. Schmidt's cousin, living 3 blocks away in similar conditions. A basement room with no heat, no water, barely any shelter from the winter cold. Kate delivered the thick envelope from Mrs. Schmidt, watched Margaret open it with shaking hands. Money, letters, addresses of relief organizations, information about how to apply for emigration to America, promises of sponsorship and help in a future beyond the ruins. Margaret read the letter from her cousin and cried. Elizabeth wants me to come to Milwaukee. She says she will sponsor me. She says there is work at the meat factory. She looked at Kate with desperate hope, fighting against learned helplessness. Is it true? Is America really like you said in your letters home? Or was that censored propaganda? Kate took Margaret's hands in hers, held them tight, looked her directly in the eyes. It is true, every word. I ate better as a prisoner than you are eating now as a free woman. And that should tell you everything you need to know about which side was telling the truth and which side was feeding us lies. The years after the war were hard for everyone, but especially for those who returned to Germany. Kate stayed in Hamburg with her mother. She used her English and her American experience to get work with the American occupation forces as a translator. The Americans needed help communicating with German civilians, needed people who spoke both languages and understood both cultures. She never forgot Mrs. Schmidt. They wrote letters back and forth for 40 years, long detailed letters about their lives, their families, their memories of the war, and the strange friendship that had formed across enemy lines. In 1908, Kate met an American soldier named Robert Mitchell, who was stationed in Hamburg with the occupation forces. He was kind and gentle and reminded her that not all military men were cruel, that some soldiers fought for good reasons and treated defeated enemies with dignity. They married in 1950 in a small ceremony in a rebuilt Hamburg church. Kate became an American by marriage, moving to Ohio where Robert had family. She was German, had lived in America as a prisoner, and became American through love. Her life crossed all the battle lines of the war, erased all the boundaries that propaganda had tried to make absolute. In 1961, Kate published a book. She called it The Enemy Who Fed Us, and it was her diary from those years in Milwaukee with additional details and context added from memory and research. The book told the truth about how American enemies had treated German prisoners better than the German government had treated its own soldiers. Some people in Germany got angry at the book. They said she was a traitor, that she was betraying the fatherland by telling these stories. But many more people read it and nodded in recognition because they knew she was telling the truth, because they had lived through the same lies and the same awakening. Anna became an American citizen in 1950 after 5 years of paperwork and interviews and waiting. She stood in a courthouse in Milwaukee and swore loyalty to the United States of America, promising to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She cried through the whole ceremony, tears of relief and joy and gratitude for a country that had taken her in when she was an enemy prisoner and given her a home. In 1952, she married Jakob Wagner, the youngest Wagner son, who had survived the war and returned to the farm. They had 4 children together and raised them on the same farm where Anna had worked as a prisoner. The children grew up speaking German at home and English at school, maintaining their heritage while embracing their American identity. In 1953, Anna brought her mother from Germany to America. The old woman stepped off the train in Milwaukee and looked around at the clean streets, the well-fed people, the shops full of goods, the peaceful prosperity. Her first words were simple and profound. "Now I understand your letters. You were not lying. This place is real." Anna's mother lived another 20 years in America, and she never once regretted leaving Germany behind. Greta became the head translator at Milwaukee County Hospital by 1955. She never married, dedicating her life to her work instead. Between 1947 and 1960, she personally helped process over 2,400 German refugees settling in the Milwaukee region. She found them housing and jobs and language classes. She translated their documents and their fears and their hopes into English so they could communicate with the Americans who were helping them rebuild their lives. In 1982, the American government awarded Greta the Presidential Citizens Medal, one of the highest honors given to civilians. She was 71 years old, standing in her best dress in a ceremony in Washington, while the president pinned the medal to her chest. The citation praised her for extraordinary humanitarian work and for building bridges between communities in post-war America. People in Milwaukee called her the Angel of Milwaukee. She smiled when she heard that, but insisted she was not an angel, just a woman trying to make amends for staying silent when she should have spoken. September 24th, 1983. Exactly 40 years after the Oktoberfest that had changed everything. Someone organized a reunion at the Concordia Club, inviting as many of the original 847 women as could be found and were still alive. 127 women came. Some flew from Germany. Some drove from across America. Some were brought by their children and grandchildren who wanted to hear the stories firsthand. They were all around 60 years old now, gray-haired and wrinkled, but still recognizably the same women who had stood confused on a Milwaukee train platform 4 decades earlier. German and American media covered the event. Reporters interviewed the women. Cameras filmed them hugging and crying and laughing and sharing old photographs and introducing their families to each other. Kate spoke standing at the front of the hall at age 64. She was a grandmother of 5 living in Ohio, but she had come back to Milwaukee for this reunion because some things were too important to miss. In 1943, we asked if we were in the wrong country, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. The answer was no. We were in the right country. We just did not know it yet. America showed us what our own country could have been if we had chosen freedom instead of following a dictator who led us to destruction. Anna spoke next, age 59, still living on the Wagner farm with her husband and grown children. This community showed me that being German does not mean being a Nazi. You can love your heritage and still love freedom. You can speak German and be American. You can be both. Germany forgot that truth. America never did. Greta was 71, the Presidential Citizen's Medal pinned to her dress. She spoke with the clarity and precision that had always characterized her thinking. We were prisoners of war, but we found freedom in captivity. We came as enemies and left as witnesses to truth. The Americans did not imprison us. Our own government imprisoned us in lies. The Americans set us free by showing us what truth looked like. The reunion lasted 3 days. The women donated materials to the Smithsonian and the Milwaukee Historical Archives. Kate's diary, 847 letters, 340 photographs. Red Cross records documenting their treatment, all preserved so the story would not be forgotten, so future generations could learn what happened when kindness confronted propaganda and truth defeated lies. In 998, a university student came to interview Greta. She was 86 years old, one of only 3 original women still alive. The student asked her to summarize her entire experience in one final statement for the historical record. Greta thought for a long moment, looking out the window at Milwaukee, the city that had become her home. Then she spoke, her voice still strong despite her age. People asked me how I could forgive the Americans for imprisoning me. I tell them the Americans did not imprison us. Our own government imprisoned us in lies. The Americans set us free. They fed our bodies with bread and our minds with truth. We came as soldiers for a lie. We left as witnesses to what humanity could be even in war. The real question is not why German Americans spoke German. It is why we did not know that Germans could be free and prosperous and good without a Führer. That realization that we could have had what these Americans had without the war and the hatred and the death, that was the hardest truth to swallow. We were never in the wrong country. We were on the wrong side. And it took the people we called enemies to show us what our own people could have been. The final numbers tell the story with the clarity that only truth can provide. 847 German women entered America between April and June 1943. 0 died in American custody. 300 became American citizens. 547 returned to Germany. 127 lived to attend the reunion in 1983. 3 were still alive in 998 when Greta gave her last interview. Their story is a footnote in history that most people have never heard. But it is also a testament to something profound about humanity and war, and the power of treating enemies with dignity. It proves that war is fought between governments but lived by people, that propaganda dies when confronted with human kindness, that the enemy often has more in common with us than our own corrupt leaders. That freedom means being able to love your heritage without hating others. Sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is admitting your country was wrong. Sometimes humanity transcends nationality, even in history's darkest hours. The 847 women learned these lessons the hardest way possible. They came as believers in a lie. They left as witnesses to truth. And their witness still speaks today, reminding us that truth is stronger than lies, that kindness is stronger than hate, that freedom is stronger than propaganda, and that American values, real American values demonstrated through action, rather than just proclaimed in speeches, can win wars without firing a shot. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below with your own family's story of coming to America, of serving in the war, of witnessing these transformations firsthand. Your stories matter. They are part of this legacy. They prove that what happened to these 847 women was not unique, that America's strength has always been in its values, in its willingness to treat even enemies as human beings worthy of dignity. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories of American history, the stories that prove our values work not through propaganda, but through lived experience. The 847 women taught us that truth always wins. It just takes time. And in America, truth has time.